This is Jim Semivan, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and we are moving out of February and into March in the coming days as you listen to this. And joining me for another appearance on the podcast, I think he must be the guest record holder at the minute. I would say, just from guest appearances, maybe 4 or 5, not including roundtables and everything else like that. He is an author, historian, researcher, and absolutely now a bona fide authority on the history of the UFO topic. He asked me to say that. And friend of mine, Mr. Graeme Rendall. Graeme, welcome back.
Hi, Andy. I really did tell you to say I was an authority on UFOs, not.
You said bona fide, and I didn't know what that meant, but I read it anyway, so I hope grammatically that's correct. But no, you definitely are, Graeme. In the few years I've known you, you kind of rise through the ranks, but I'm not going to keep sniffing your arse as we discuss this. So, Graeme, you've been on, like I say, many times. I think probably all in, including roundtables and stuff, well over 10, 12 appearances on the podcast. But very briefly, for those who aren't familiar with you, give us a quick background of who you are and how you came to be involved in the UFO topic.
Yeah, long-time aviation enthusiast, long-time interest in UFOs since, 50 years now, getting on for 50 years now. So quite a long time. World War II, interested in that. All those things came together with a Foo Fighters book, history I wrote in 2021. And then from there, I've written a few books about pilot and aircrew encounters with UFOs, the latest of which I hope we're talking about today.
Your new work then, we're going to talk about Chasing Shadows, Aerial and UFO Encounters, 1955 to 1956. Graeme's work is known for being incredibly detailed, so you'd be forgiven for thinking this was encounters from 5 to 8 to 4 minutes to 8 at night, but no, it's not the 24-hour clock. It is the year 1955 to 1956. So Graeme, when did you start working on this one?
This one started probably about Easter last year, so I had about 6 months to sort of look at it and research it and write it, and then it was slowing down towards the end of the year. I'd already contacted Bryce Zabel, who people hopefully will know who he is, Hollywood producer, co-producer of Dark Skies, also co-host of the podcast Need to Know, and also somebody I met in Roswell last year and gone with like a house on fire. And I'd asked
Graeme, he also co-authored the book AD After Disclosure with Richard Dolan.
He did, yes, which I've read, and it's very, very good. So yeah, somebody who I got on with quite well. We had a kind of shared interest in the history of ufology, not just the current stuff. And then when I asked him to write the foreword, he said, yeah, straight away, yeah, I'll do it. So I was waiting for that, and also waiting for the artwork from our good friends Olaf Rockner and Dan Zetterstrom of this parish. So that all came together at the end of January, and then the book came out. So yeah, here it is.
You're putting together a sort of Encyclopedia Britannica almost collection of the UFO history, and at this rate I think you're going to catch up to modern day sometime around June of this year. The books come out incredibly detailed, Graeme. A lot of work goes into them. They aren't just slapdash, here's a chat GPT version of a book. It's still very much the human element put into it. What's special for you about this time period? Because when you're locking in dates, now I'm going to look really quickly at the books behind me. You've got 1950 to 1952, 1940 to 1945, 53 to 54. What is it that made you think, what, we're going to narrow down 55 to 56?
I mean, sometimes it's a case of you look at how many cases over specific years or a number of years, and you think, I can't really fit all those into one volume. So occasionally it's just a kind of a nice bite size to put in. So 2 years rather than 3 years or 4 years. But also this is when the major radar visual cases started appearing. So it's nice to actually put quite a few of those in. And we'll talk about one of those in a minute, I believe. So we have those kind of cases coming along. As of all the previous books that I've written on this topic, we have the pilot sightings, the aircrew sightings, etc. So there's nothing necessarily specific in terms of why I chose those 2 years, but just because it was 2 years which are quite easy to write about. It's quite succinct, so therefore you're not kind of sprawling account of many years, which people are either going to tire of reading, or they're going to think it's too much, or there's too much detail. It's just quite a nice bite-sized chunk for people to get their teeth into, really.
There's a mix of listeners and viewers to this podcast. Some will consume everything, and God help them. They spend that much time with me. Others will pick and choose. I think that's probably quite common among podcasting, whether it's news updates, whether it's interviews, whether it's particular types of interviews. I think there's even a split now between people who listen to the more historical stuff, and I think there's a real appetite for, less interest in what's happening now almost, and looking back. You're very much someone who likes, you keep your eye on what's happening now, but your work that you've done so far is very much focused on what's past. And I wonder what's so important to you still about the history of a topic when you're writing about something that's now 18, 90, almost 100 years ago.
I think it doesn't have to be about UFOs. If you talk about politics or social issues, you have to look at what's happened beforehand to understand what's happening now, because there's parallels, there's lessons from history as well. So if you don't know what your history is, usually you end up repeating it, and it's a famous phrase. But it is true that people just kind of reinvent the wheel. So they do things and they don't think there's a precedent for it, but actually that usually is. It might not be exactly the same, sort of things that happen, but they're quite sort of similar, and you can learn from what's happened in the past. Hopefully you don't repeat the same mistakes. But when we just look at the kind of, the congressional hearings, well, we've actually had that in the past, albeit in a very, very small time frame. It was about 1960, in the mid to late 1960s, when there was a congressional hearing, but it didn't go anywhere. So this is, you're hoping that history's not going to repeat itself there. But also we have official UFO investigation programs, set up by the US government. Well, the Air Force did that. The US Air Force did that back in the late 40s and early 50s. And what did it turn out to be? Blue Book effectively turned out to be a public relations exercise on behalf of the Air Force to dampen down enthusiasm for reporting UFOs, and to basically dismiss the sightings that were reported to them, and anything that didn't fit, like a kind of square peg in a round hole. It was just a case of, well, it's probably just a weather balloon sort of thing. So, and you just wonder how much of that's true today. So knowing about what's happened in the past informs you about what's going to happen in the future. So I think it's very, very important that people who are, especially those who are just coming to the topic now, have one eye on the past, because it does inform. It gives you a bit of an extra kind of sort of look at what's happening now, because you can have one eye on the past and do that. But for the people who are coming into the topic now, they only have six. If they came in 2017 with those famous 3 FLIR videos, they have 6 years, just over 6 years of history. Well, actually, the topic goes, decades, 6 decades, 7 decades, 8 decades, and more before that. So it's really important.
You mentioned, obviously, Blue Book, I think, was in full swing round about 55, 56. You've touched on there were 2 predecessors to Blue Book, 2 UFO investigations by the US government before that. Is that right, too?
That's correct, yeah. So Blue Book started in March 52, and the 2 before that were Project Sign and Project Grudge. And Project Sign started at the beginning of 1948. So it took basically 6 months or 5 or 6 months from when Kenneth Arnold's sighting took place in June 47, and a few others after that. The wheels of intelligence in the United States Air Force, or the Army Air Force as it was at that time, it ground quite slowly, but actually they did get to the point where they thought that we're going to have to set something up to look at this officially, and that was Project Sign. And it lasted for about a year, and then in about September, October of that year, they came up with what you call an estimate of the situation, which is effectively their ideas as to what's going on. And it was passed up the chain of command, and various high-ranking intelligence officers looked at it. And because there wasn't actually any proof to the assertions that these things might be interplanetary, because that was one of the conclusions, then it was battered back down by General Hoyt Vandenberg, who was one of the really high up kind of chief officers in the US Air Force in the intelligence branch. So it went nowhere. And then the focus shifted from, well, what are they? We don't know what they are. Could they possibly be, sort of extraterrestrials? To, well, they must have red stars on them. They must be Russian, or they're some kind of domestic craft that somewhere in America is being built by somebody and they're not telling us, that kind of thing. So the emphasis changed when Project Grudge was set up at the beginning of 1949 to replace Sign, and that's where the emphasis changed to. But actually, Grudge had next to no resources, had next to no personnel. It was effectively just a filing program. reports came in, and they were just filed. There wasn't that much investigation work done on them. It was only much later, probably about mid-51, maybe a little bit later, when Ruppelt came on board. He wasn't still director then of Blue Book, but they got him to try and sort of change things around. And then in March 52, became the director, and he stayed on for a couple of years. And then there was a whole host of different people in Blue Book, most of whom didn't want anything to do with it. It was a kind of it was just a step on the ladder to something else. And their with a few exceptions, but their focus was making themselves look good, making sure they could show reports that said, "Look, we've cleared up all these sightings. We know what we can explain all these things." And of course, that would sit well with the generals and with the senior officers to say, "Yeah, you've done a great job. You've done your 2 years or whatever. Now here's a nice little plum assignment somewhere else for you." So that's what they wanted to do, basically. Just keep the nose clean. Don't rock the boat. Don't say that these things are really strange and we don't know what they are. Just toe the Air Force line.
You mentioned obviously that time period, your early 50s to mid 50s were only a few years removed from the end of the Second World War. Mm-hmm. What's the cultural state of play that the Russians, and maybe this is a bit of a history lesson for me, thinking I've not done it since I was in school, but the Russians and the US were allies, Second World War. Mm-hmm. What changed, or did anything change even? That it was a common goal, defeating Nazism, that all of a sudden they're thinking, these are Russian planes that we're seeing when they were friends, quote unquote.
I suppose the Russians were always after things to help them win their side, their part of the war. So, it was almost begrudgingly, accepting, foreign support kind of thing, because nowadays they almost refuse to recognize the fact that, America sent thousands of airplanes and tanks and trucks and jeeps, via the Lend-Lease program to Russia. And of course, by the end of the Second World War, the Russians had already taken over most of Eastern Europe. And they were installing their own puppet governments to take control of likes of Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc., etc. And they just never went away. So their occupation forces were there until 1989. Yes, okay, governments might have changed, but it was still communist. The Russians called the shots. So the East Germans, the Czechs, the Bulgarians, Romanians, etc., they couldn't really jump without the Russian, the Politburo saying, how high you have to jump, sort of thing. So there was always that. And of course, on the other side, so you have a divide where you have the West, and NATO was set up to bulwark this kind of Warsaw Pact, this bloc, the Eastern Bloc. And so you have two sides which are diametrically opposed in terms of culture and politics. And you have this Iron Curtain which suddenly descends across Europe, which was Churchill's phrase, I believe. And then it became formalized much later on when they built the Berlin Wall, which is actually after this time frame. That was more 61, I think. But also there were military buildups. So the Russians had forces in Eastern Europe poised to attack NATO, if ever such come to that. And of course, we were building up forces. So the Americans were they had stuff stationed in Europe as well. They were building air bases in Germany. They were building air bases in France at this time. So the forces were stacked against each other, and both sides had atomic weapons as well. They'd had them for some time. I think the Russians exploded their first atom bomb in the late 40s, might have been 49, and then by 1956, possibly the first, I think maybe the first hydrogen bombs had come along as well on the American side. So the kind of the possibilities for actually everybody wiping themselves out were just getting really, really much more at that time. And the Cold War was getting towards its coldest point. It wouldn't get there until 62 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was sort of cooling right down to the point of it would just need some kind of flashpoint and everybody would be at each other's throats.
What's the public perception in the West then of the UFO topic? We had the Kenneth Arnold sighting. Roswell's happened at this point, which has been a news story, and it's gone away. We're not talking worldwide news at that point. There's no social media, no internet, all very much still local and confined. These things, if they're going to reach out, can die off very, very quickly as well. And I wonder, who's talking about what? Are we still talking about, Foo Fighters, just lights in the sky? Are we seeing more discs? Are we starting to see triangles yet? What's the state of play there?
So the Foo Fighters kind of phenomenon basically died out within sort of 6 months of the war. Nobody was talking about it in terms of the press and the general population. There was some sort of murmurings about it in the next few years in intelligence reports here and there, but it did sort of die a death very, very shortly afterwards. Once Kenneth Arnold's sighting occurred in towards the end of June 1947, the papers in America were full of stories of what they call flying discs, because that was the first term that was used, and that was actually the official term as well, because the term UFO, or unidentified flying object, wouldn't appear until the early 1950s. So that was the term they used, and actually there was quite a lot of stuff in the papers. It was quite a popular story. If anybody had a local UFO sighting, it wouldn't make the local papers. They would often make the national papers, because in America stories were syndicated. So you get you get a press release, sort of report from United Press or Associated Press, and it would just go around all the local papers. So you could have a story up in the northwest of America, and it would end up in a southeast Florida a newspaper as well. So that's how it all worked. And until about 1952, when the 2 July weekends, the things that happened over Washington, D.C., the kind of coverage just ramped up. It just got bigger and bigger, the stories, and there was kind of the speculation grew as to what these things were. And there was not quite a sense of panic, but it was just a sense of frustration and worry maybe as to what these things were. Were they Russian? It wasn't the kind of case of were they Chinese, but were they Russian, or were they something else entirely? Why were they just flying over the states at will? Now, this was replicated to a certain extent, but a much lesser extent in Britain. So we started picking up on those kind of stories as well in the probably the early 1950s. Some of the first stories about UFOs in Britain appeared in the press, the national press and the local press in Britain. But we didn't have the same huge number of sightings that happened across America. We had the Flying Saucer Working Party, which is something set up by the government, but it didn't get very far. And of course, the outcome was there's nothing to see here, move along. So in terms of our in Britain, there wasn't a huge amount, although it did make newsreel, the news programs of the day. So there were interviews with airliner crews and other people and some fighter pilots before the RAF told them, you can't talk about this without permission. So those things do exist as well. So there was some talk about it in the media, whether it was newsreels or print, but not as much as America. Now, in 1954, there was a huge wave of sightings across France in the autumn of that year, and it was almost that if you look at the papers across France for a period from about sort of mid-August right through the end of the year, not a day went by without not just one report of a UFO, but tens of reports. In mid-October that year, some of the day, probably about 2 or 3 day period, there was something like 40, 50, 60 reports across France each day. And it wasn't just in one tiny area, it was right across the country. And it wasn't just daylight, discs in the sky at daylight or lights in the sky at night. These were saucers that were seen in fields at the side of roads when people were driving down country lanes. There were things that were sitting in the middle of roads even and stopping cars. And then they had these humanoids next to them that were reported. Some were like hairy dwarfs, and other times they looked a bit more human. So there's whole loads of stories from then. How many of them are true, then you can't really say. But it was almost like a fever that spread across France in the second half of that year. But of course, by 1956, that had died down a bit. But you saw the emphasis shift from America just being a purely American phenomenon to something that was much more worldwide.
And just before we get to some of the contents of the book, Graeme, paint that picture of where are we technologically, what's in the skies, what is the pinnacle of technology people would maybe be used to seeing? I think people then probably had less knowledge of what was in the sky than we do now. Same with like technology just in modern day. What sort of things have people got, just to kind of set the scene for what we're going to talk about?
Well, if you're talking about kind of things flying, because obviously people are looking, most of the stuff in the books to do with things in the sky. So yes, you still have weather balloons. You have various types of balloons, ones that usually have instrument packages on them. So ones for high altitude research, because they're doing a lot of that kind of thing here. But they were known by the pilots. They were quite common. You saw them quite a lot. People on the ground saw them quite a bit as well. In terms of aircraft, commercial airliners, so the ones you went on your holidays to, or you flew across America to, or you went on the first package holidays, they were propeller driven mostly still. So the kind of the most common and the most up-to-date ones were from the Douglas Company. They were like DC-6s, 4-engined aircraft, but they were still propeller-driven. The first jet airliners were still a couple of years away, really, coming into mainstream service. Now, in terms of jet fighters and jet bombers in the air forces, yes, those existed. They were getting slightly more sophisticated from the first ones. The first supersonic aircraft were coming out, and they were just going into service about that time as well. Although the dates are just beyond the time frame of this book for mass production of these particular aircraft. So we're just on the cusp of a kind of faster aeroplanes. But so these are still sort of first and second generation jet fighters. So you're looking at F-86 Sabres for the American Air Force, which are the kind of Korean War vintage airplanes, if you like. So maybe a few years beforehand, but they're still in service. And in fact, in some air forces, they were still using propeller-driven airplanes, which were Second World War vintage. And actually, one of those we'll talk about in a minute as well when we're talking about the book in depth. So there's a bit of a kind of a mixture of airplanes in the skies. In terms of rockets, yes, the Americans and the Russians were experimenting with rockets during this time frame. It wasn't just the V2s that they'd captured from the Germans. They were developing their own. So they'd progressed to improved V2s, and then they were building their own designs based on that technology. And it wasn't a million miles away from it, but it was sufficiently improved that they were almost on the cusp of being able to put a satellite in orbit, but not quite that far. And the Americans and the Russians were now engaged in a kind of technological race to try and do that kind of thing, or to actually, sort of get somebody towards the moon, because that was the ultimate goal. Whoever controls the stars might control the Earth. So there was always a push out of away from the Earth. So yeah, there's quite a lot of technical, logical kind of breakthroughs just on the horizon, but they're not there yet in terms of the mid-50s.
So let's get to the book then, Graeme, Chasing Shadows. Beautiful cover, like you mentioned, the artwork again by Dan and Olaf at 33 Ounce Creative. If folks want to check them out for any artistic needs, very much worth doing so. Captain Thomas Mantell is a case that is well known in the history books for being a pilot who, should I say allegedly, Graeme? I know you like to keep things factual. He was killed, we know that, but for chasing and trying to intercept a UFO. But you've written in this book about a potential second similar incident to this, and I think this is something that caught a little bit of attention last year as we heard David Grush and co talk about the UFO topic, and have military personnel been killed after coming into contact or through any sort of experience with these unidentified objects. And it's something that does really capture the imagination. It's quite sinister, but I think it's something that people kind of gravitate towards. So tell us about this particular case.
Yeah, so I'll put a caveat straight away. Like the Thomas Mantell case, it is allegedly, because the Thomas Mantell case, the jury's out as to what happened there, whether he was chasing a balloon, whether he was chasing Venus, or whether indeed it was a UFO. And it depends on which side of the fence and what bits of information you choose to look at as to what influences your opinion on that. Now, this is a similar one, and it's actually not as clear-cut either, because the information is a bit kind of secondhand, but it actually happened 8 years after the Thomas Mantell case, almost to the day. So this is January 56, and it's actually the same unit that Thomas Mantell was with. So that's the Kentucky Air National Guard, and it's actually the same type of airplane as well. It's the F-51 Mustang, which is involved. So this is, you have all these little parallels. But he's called Lee Merkel, and he's a commander of that particular unit. He'd been a World War II veteran. He'd fought, I think he'd flown something like 140 combat missions in North Africa and Italy. He was highly decorated. I think he'd left the Air Force after the war. He'd done some work with the Veterans Administration, and then he'd come back. He was regarded as possibly one of the best Mustang pilots there was still flying in the time of 56. And in that area of Kentucky, there'd been some UFO sightings at the beginning of January, and they dispatched jets up to investigate these. But when the jets had got near these contacts, then they just fled, and the jet pilots had never managed to catch these things. But later, this is towards the end of the month, so it's actually the last day of the month, and a similar thing apparently happened, and jets were sent up but they couldn't catch these UFOs. But jets back then had limited fuel anyway. They would burn quite a lot of their fuel actually just getting up to altitude. So therefore, their kind of loiter time and their patrol time and their combat time was very limited before they had to come back to base, because in-flight refueling wasn't really a thing back then. But a propeller-driven aircraft, albeit a much slower aeroplane than the jet fighters, could stay up longer, and so therefore it was more useful in maybe if you're looking for something that you don't know where it is. So he apparently, now this is according to not to documentation, but to things that people have been told at the time. He was sent up after this UFO, and then the next thing is he's about 30,000 odd feet up, and he's saying, "I'm fine. This thing's below me. I'm going to have a look." This is kind of echoes of Mantell's case, where he said he was at a certain altitude, it's above me, and I'm going to close in and have a look as well. So you can see all these parallels. And the next thing that apparently happened was that the Air Force Base, or the Air Force, were contacted by a civilian to say there's aircraft wreckage over this farm, and unfortunately he died. He perished in the crash. Now, when it came to the official documents in terms of the crash, the crash investigation, there was no mention of UFOs at all. But there's quite a large redacted section in the report, which makes you wonder, well, what did they take out? But actually, the person who this all hinges on is a guy called Frank Edwards. And some people might be aware of who he was. He was a famous radio show host, announcer and writer in the 50s and 60s, and he had a deep interest in UFOs. And it wasn't just an interest. He was actually quite well connected to a lot of people as well. He had numerous contacts, not just in the industry, but in the Air Force. And one of them was actually Lee Merkel. In fact, to the point where he was actually a friend. He was a close friend of his. And Frank Edwards had actually been informed, through channels or on the quiet, that he had in fact been chasing a UFO that day, and various things like that. So it wasn't a case of it was just he just had some kind of ordinary flying accident. Now the stuff, the various bits entered the news, but nothing about UFOs. However, NICAP, the National Investigations Committee of Anomalous Phenomenon, Aerial Phenomenon, they got involved in this case eventually, and tried to get some information out, but it didn't really go anywhere. Frank Edwards, I'm just going to read something out from the book, if you don't mind, just a little bit. Frank Edwards himself actually gave a talk at a meeting which was organised by a group called Civilian Source of Intelligence of New York. It was one of the kind of little sort of groups back then. They had a newsletter each month, but they did lectures as well. And Frank Edwards gave this talk in April '56, so not long after the event. And he said that 3 weeks later, on January 31st, just before I went on the air, I got a call from our Bloomington studio. We've got a picture for you of the wreckage of a National Guard plane that crashed down here. And then he says, the following day, I discovered through a friend of mine in Louisville that the jets had been up again after unidentified objects south of Bloomington, just as on the 8th of the month, and the jets had lost them. But Colonel Merkel, who was in charge of the National Guard Air Base at Louisville, had taken off in a P-51 Mustang. He had oxygen tanks, and the plane was in excellent condition. He got up because he could fly longer than the jets, and the jets were trying to vector him on the UFO. And he goes on to actually talk about how he was trying to chase it, how he got above it, and he said, "I'm looking down on it. I'm going to close in," and then the next thing they know, it's crashed. So there's, it depends. Again, it depends on who you believe. And what you think about the entire subject as to whether you think there's something in that or not. But in terms of Frank Edwards, who, yes, he was a believer, but he was clued up about a lot of things back then. He didn't sort of go into huge wild fantasies most of the time, and he was well connected. So if people were telling him things, on the quiet, then there might well have been some truth to it.
I like that Civilian Saucer Intelligence New York is CSI New York, which I'm sure was a crime scene investigation New York program back in the day. But that was the original, the Civilian Saucer Intelligence. That needs to be picked up by a TV studio. And I wonder, going back to that official US Air Force accident report you mentioned, and if people are watching on YouTube, I'm looking off to the side, only because Graeme sent me some of the content through that he's talking about, and I'm looking at the report itself, so I'm not just ignoring Graeme. Like you say, if that's an A4 page, you're looking at a fifth of the page is redacted, that big block. what is likely to be within that redacted section for you, Graeme? Do you think that's going to be, as part of this incident, it's likely this was an unidentified flying object or saucer that was chased? Is it something more personal details, military based? What's your thinking?
It could be either, and it could be something about the conditions of the airplanes. Although it's more, if it's redacted, it's more likely to be information in terms of personal details or to do with UFOs. It could well be either, Andy. I really don't know, and I don't think anybody's actually come up with what it is yet. I know there have been people who have suggested it, and then the last thing about this story is that Lee Merkel's son ended up being a reporter on a Massachusetts newspaper. And he was quite young when his dad died. And the Air Force basically told his mother that it was just, that there was oxygen failure. Like the Mantell case again, there was somebody, he died because he didn't have oxygen. But this is when Lee Merkel Jr. referred the case to NICAP, and he tried to get them to say, can you send me what information you've got? And that was when they sent him an interview they had with a reporter who'd also received information independent of Frank Edwards to say, your dad was chasing UFOs that day. So, yeah. And funny enough, I do remember and I've got this in the book as well, that back in the old days of the bulletin boards, that before your time, Andy, probably this is like 1990s, Lee Merkel's son was on there on one of the UFO bulletin boards at the dial-up connection days, actually talking about this incident, and I had to find that. And I put that in the book as well, because he talks about his dad's crash.
It's an interesting one, and for me, it does stay vague, doesn't it? And it leaves open to interpretation. As much as I'd love to say, same as you, I know you want to bang straight in, Graeme, with this is ET, but we have to be fair here, don't we? And just leave it open. And you do that well. You do that well, reporting on the facts. Moving on, then, a different case within the book. You mentioned one from France. This is an international, so worldwide phenomenon, as the quote famously says. And you've not just stuck to US cases here. So go on, tell us about the Orly Phantom from 18th of February 1956.
Yeah, so it's actually the last few minutes of the 17th and a few hours into the 18th. And this is Orly Airport, which is one of the major Paris airports nowadays. And it was the major airport back then as well. It actually started a bit kind of earlier in the evening. And there was a US later that same day, the 18th, there was a US transport plane who were down in the south of France. They were just taken up from Marseille, and they were flying north, and they seen a kind of this star-shaped object in the sky, and they didn't think much more of it until later in the day, a couple of days later, when all this press reporting came out about this Paris incident. But it turned out to happen on the same day. So this is the kind of thing where things were multiple things were being seen on the same day. But actually earlier that day, about midnight, so 24 hours beforehand, Orly Airport was effectively besieged by an object that was flying around and causing mayhem in terms of aircraft going out and planes having to avoid it, and it following aircraft coming into the airport, the radar operators picking it up and knowing what it was. Whatever it was showing not just a blip on the radar, but what they called a banana-shaped fog around it. So there was this kind of weird kind of contact that was being shown. And by the time the French Air Force actually got interceptors up to go and try and investigate, it was 3 hours afterwards. And of course they were too late. And there's shades of the Washington events of July 52, where the Air Force turned up hours after these events started. And every time the jets come, the UFOs disappear. When the jets go back for fuel, the UFOs come back again. So we have this strange object that they thought it was a winking red light. So, you just think it's another aircraft. But this thing hovered at times. It then shot off at credible speed, only to stop again. And say it followed a Swiss Air aeroplane. There was a Air France DC-3, piloted by Michel Desavoy, I believe the pilot's name was. And he was flying on a regular mail run to London and back, which happened pretty much every night. And as soon as he took off, he saw this thing was just almost in front of his aeroplane. He was told by the tower, it's there. He saw it just to the right of his aircraft. It was heading in his direction. He had to turn the aeroplane away from it. And then the next thing he knows, it disappears. And then he gets a call from the tower at Orly to say, it's right above you. So there's all this kind of weird and wonderful stuff going on. And it appeared, it was probably over a period of 3 or 4 hours that this object was very, very close to Orly Airport. And the strange thing was, because it was picked up on the civilian radar at the airport, but not on a nearby military base's military radar, which was very, very strange, because they were asked if they had any knowledge of it, and they said no. Now, obviously, we don't know whether they did or not, but they denied it. So you have to take their words at face value. But yeah, it was very, very strange. And it didn't just make the French newspapers either. It appeared, this story appeared in the British newspapers. It appeared in the American newspapers as well.
Let me ask, where is radar technology at this point, and how reliable is it?
It's reasonably reliable. It still suffers from things like radar angels, from weather effects, what they call anomalous propagation. But it's certainly far removed from wartime radar, where you would have a kind of blip. You had to work it out from a line on a chart on a display, which would just go up and down, and you had to work out where distance and vector from two lines basically. Whereas by 56, you actually had what they call a PPI, which was what we think of a radar system now, with a moving line going around a circle, picks up a blip. That's what you would see at a radar controller station in those days. So it was much better. It still had problems in terms of it could pick up, ground, clutter and things like that. But they were getting better, and the people who used these systems, they were much more in tune with knowing where the faults lay and whether there was things like that would happen. It wasn't just a case of, here's a radar system, just go and use it. We won't tell you about things that might happen. They were really well trained by then. And of course, if you were working in a busy airport like Orly, you would be really well trained.
I'm going to ask you to guesstimate or speculate on, given all you know about the history of what was in the air, the technology at the time, and what was being reported, how much of these sightings do you think were misidentifications compared to being something truly anomalous?
Some of them would be, because invariably, humans aren't infallible. So some things would have been kind of mistaken for ordinary items. But in the case, you just go back to the Orly case. This thing was moving around at 2,000 miles an hour occasionally, and then it's coming to a dead halt. So you haven't got any technology back in those days that could do that. Even the supersonic airplanes of the day, the ones which were just almost coming into production, that were still on test, basically, they weren't capable of doing that kind of speed. You'd be looking at a rocket to go 2,000 miles an hour. And of course, a rocket can't stop in midair. So the technology wasn't available to do this kind of stuff. Yes, helicopters were around, and a lot of or at least some of the cases from France in 1954 possibly were helicopters, especially if they were seen at a distance by somebody. Let's say an object in a field, maybe half a mile or a mile away, because some of the cases were like that. And if something looks like a little shiny object with maybe a couple of figures walking around it, and then there's two little lines left in the field in terms of traces the following day, and you don't see rotors at that distance, and you might not see it leave, yes, okay, that might well be a helicopter. But in a lot of the cases, some of the things and the way that they're described as disappearing when the witnesses come across them, and the fact that they could hover in midair and then fly off and all the rest of it, that's not the technology that was around then, and helicopters couldn't go at that speed anyway. So you just have to kind of think, well, okay, we've ruled this out, we've ruled that out. What's left? And what's left is quite fantastic, really. It just makes the mind boggle.
Put a number on it, percentage. What's the comparison anomalous to misidentification?
I can't. I mean, there will be. Blue Books, when Blue Book had 12,000 cases over a 17-year period, they still had a significant, as in hundreds of cases, which they couldn't, at all explain. And that was even after they'd written off some. Quite a large percentage, maybe 10% or so, as being balloons, just because balloon was mentioned in a possibility, or that was one 100 miles away or 10 miles away, and that they would say, oh, well, that was a balloon then. So they were also making things up as they went along to try and solve cases. So you can see from that there was probably a quite significant proportion of those 12,000 cases which needed more scrutiny, if not yes, okay, they're UFOs. It wasn't the case that it was only a very, very small percentage, like 5%, 3%. I think in fact, in this book, I talk about the Special Report 14, which is a Blue Book report, where they went through a whole load of cases and they put all the numbers through computers, etc., tried to look for trends, and it came out with a figure of 3%. And the 3% wasn't 3% unknown, it was 3% that we can probably explain if we have some more information.
Okay. And what percentage were ET? Still nothing.
You don't get me that easy.
No. And one final part of the book you wanted to talk about, an incident of pilot deviation. This is one you said the pilot, before we recorded, flip-flopped on, didn't he, as opposed to the story. But let's talk about that one.
So he's called Raymond Ryan. He's he flies for it's one of the big airlines. I think it was American Airlines, and he's flying a Convair 240 from down in New York up to Buffalo. So this is the northeast of the United States, and it's one of these scheduled flights where he goes to a number of places en route. One of which was Syracuse, but midway before he gets to Syracuse, there's this. Well, it's quite bright light in the sky, and nobody knows what it is. And it gets to the point where he's in contact with Griffiths Air Force Base, which is one of the local military airfields, and they are having difficulty trying to work out what it is, and they haven't got jets up after it yet. And they actually say to him, "Can you follow it? Can you deviate from your scheduled flight path and follow it?" Which he does, or at least he said he did. And it actually took him to the point where he was flying just over Lake Ontario, which is almost into Canada, and he's 5 miles over the edge of the lake and heading into Canada. And he calls it a day because he's not getting any closer to this light. By that time, the jets had been scrambled, but they never caught up with it either. Now, afterwards, when he lands at Buffalo, because he obviously gets there in the end, there's reporters obviously asking him stuff, and he gives them quotes, one of which is that I did follow this UFO. So that appears in the papers. He's on a chat show, because television was a thing then, and he's on a program called Meet the Millers, and him and his first officer, a guy called Neff, are being interviewed by the two hosts, and they talk about what happened in this incident, and they say and it does come that they actually followed it, and that they turned back 5 miles over the lake. So that had to be a deviation from their flight path, because that wasn't the way to get to Buffalo. And then when it actually comes much later, when Donald Cahill gets involved, he was a noted thorn in the side of the Air Force, but also he was a director of NICAP in the early days. So he gets involved, and he writes to Ryan and says, well, can you give me some more information about what's happened beyond what you've said in the press? And Ryan basically contacts him and says, I didn't deviate from my course. It's a flat denial. Now, you can understand why somebody might say that, because really, airline pilots shouldn't be sort of chasing after ghosts or chasing after shadows, even without authorization from their company. Not the Air Force. They shouldn't be telling them what to do. So it got escalated to the Civilian Aeronautics Administration, which is their version of our Civil Aviation Authority. And NICAP asked them, the CAA, to basically investigate. So they must have contacted Ryan, because they came back with a flat denial from Ryan to say, I deviated from course. And that also contacted American Airlines, and they said, no, he hadn't either. They came up with a figure of, I think it was 49 minutes for the flight time from, I think it was Albany to Syracuse, because that was the leg of the flight where he deviated from. They said it was 49 minutes. The flight log that Ryan is supposed to have filled in and submitted said 48 minutes flying time. So they said, well, he couldn't have possibly diverted from course because it's within a minute. But it got a bit kind of, he said, she said. However, it then got into the hands of the Civilian Aeronautics Board, which was kind of like an overseeing organization, and they did their own investigation. Now, it also came up with, he didn't deviate, but there was a safety officer from that organization who, on the quiet, apparently told Kehoe, yes, he did. he contacted, he was in contact with Griffiths Air Force Base by radio. So it was again one of these things where there's a kind of a conflict in the terms of the information. There's a difference of opinion, and he was quite happy to say, yes, I did all this, up until the point where it became official, and then I think it got a bit kind of maybe I shouldn't be saying this anymore.
Do you think this is one of the early instances of the stigma around the subject and how it's reported, how it's talked about? It's then it seeped into the media, and pilots very much feeling this isn't worth my job, this isn't worth the hassle, the stigma, the career.
It's certainly one of the high profile ones, but in terms of the stigma of airline pilots, actually that happened for years beforehand. That started in the early 1950s. Ruppelt talks about when he was still part of Blue Book, and this is, I think, just around the time of the two weekends in Washington in July '52. He is on a stopover on a commercial flight. He's flying, not almost as a civilian, even though he's got his Air Force gear on, and he's. I think he goes he sees one of the pilots and he talks to him about UFOs. Have you seen any? Just like an offhand comment, and the guy says, "There's a coffee shop across the street. Wait there. I'll bring some friends." And 6 of them or so turn up, and they're all airline pilots, and they basically talk to him about that. And the gist of it is, we're not going to tell people about what we see because it just goes south on us. So the stigma was there much earlier, but of course that was getting ramped up all the time. And by '56. Pilots, not just American military pilots, not just in America, but also in the UK, were being told categorically, you will not tell the press about what you see without prior authorization from the Air Force. And actually, it was a contravention of regulations in the States. And therefore, if they had gone across against what was called Air Force Regulation 200, then there would have been severe penalties. They could have been put into jail. And the careers ruined if the Air Force had actually done what they said they would do to the pilots who transgressed those rules. And in Britain, the RAF pilots, after a few initial contacts with the press, the RAF turned around and said, "Yeah, you cannot talk to the press unless we say so." And of course, they never said so. And when they did say so, however, it was always, we didn't really see anything. It was all kind of watered down.
Graeme, before we wrap up with some modern day chat, I want to touch on some listener questions for you. Some of those were built into the body of the interview, so thanks if you got in touch. Question from Max Young. Max asks, in your view, Graeme, what is the most compelling UFO encounter of the previous century?
Oh, compelling. Yeah, I like this the Socorro, the 1964, Lonnie Zamora. That's the one I really do like, and it's the one that keeps cropping up every so often. So that's one of them at least. Why? It's just because it's a really interesting story. He's chasing a speeding vehicle out of town. He sees this and he hears this roar, thinks it's an explosion, thinks it's an ammunition shack blowing up. He drives off down this desert road. He comes over a crest and he sees what he thinks is a car that's crashed. It's upended on its tail with two people next to it, and he thinks there's been a car crash. And he gets out of his car to investigate. And of course, these beings, climb into this thing, and it takes off and shoots away. So it's just one of those amazing stories from back then. And it's one of the ones I remember reading about when I was really young. And it's probably just one of those that stuck with me. I mean, there are others, but that's one of them. So.
Any others then? You mentioned others, so go on, give me one more.
Okay. So more recently, the ones I've got into, the one I keep talking about when I talk about the Foo Fighters, the disc that was shot at by the gunners on the Wellington bomber, the one that's an orange disc that comes behind an RAF Wellington, and the tail gunner shoots at it. It moves round to the wingtip, and they're still shooting at it. It moves round to the front of the airplane. The nose gunner shoots at it, and then it shoots off into the heavens, all without any kind of damage or any kind of effect on this light that these gunners are shooting at during the middle of World War II. So that's a really, really strange story that I just don't have an answer to at all. It doesn't match any kind of German technology. So that's a really weird one. But then again, I mean, I guess a compelling one of the modern day is the Nimitz encounters, and I'm not obviously don't need to discuss that one. Well, I'm sure we're all familiar with it, but that's such a multi-layered story. I mean, you have radar, you have previous events, you have jet jet pilots. Not just one. You have multiple pilots who saw it. Who saw this object, that they filmed it. It has incredible speed, acceleration, maneuverability. It's light years almost ahead of contemporary technology. So yeah, these are really compelling stories.
Question from Newman, and you'll have to get your notepad and pen out for this one, Graeme. I think you'll be okay. So here we go. With aerospace companies in the US having experienced in the mid-1950s a bit of an anti-gravity craze, does Graeme consider it possible that some of the reported sightings of flying saucers, at least in the States, were actually of experimental aircraft and test platforms for new propulsion systems, such as AVRO Canada? Especially considering that certain reported design elements of UFOs back then seemed to be reflecting elements of traditional 1950s US aircraft design. For example, porthole windows, silver appearance due to leaving military aircraft unpainted, etc.
So AVRO Canada's designs went nowhere. I mean, John Frost was the designer of the was it Project Y? It had numbers, I think, as well, if I remember rightly, the project name. But yeah, it went nowhere. They managed to make a mock-up of it, but it didn't go anywhere beyond that. In terms of anti-gravity, funny enough, I've just bought a book about Townsend Brown. I think that his name is. It's a history of him, and there's some interesting things said about him. In so much as he was allegedly parachuted into Germany to look at technology they were working on towards the end of the war. I haven't read it yet; it's still in my to-be-read pile. So I'd like to have a look at that before I sort of answer that question, because I don't feel I'm sort of sufficiently informed about the possibilities for what anti-gravity kind of research was being done at that time. From what I'm aware of at the moment, there wasn't that much. Nothing that came to fruition anyway. But that doesn't mean to say there wasn't something locked away or there's information I'm not aware of yet.
And final question from the listeners. Had Chris Barnett, I'd moved that a line there, has to be, Graeme, it's definitely aliens, isn't it?
It's definitely aliens, Chris. Not. I don't know. Sorry. I was going to write a sign, Andy, and say it's definitely aliens, but I forgot.
No. And if anyone's hearing Graeme for the first time, Graeme, even face-to-face when we meet for coffees, Graeme's one of the few people... Actually, Graeme's the person that I've met most face-to-face since I got involved in this whole podcasting thing, because he lives pretty close to where I stay. Well, reasonably close. We enjoy meeting up for a coffee. But Graeme is as difficult to get an answer out of on the alien ET side of things, the speculation side of things in person as he is recording. So if you've missed out on the in-joke there, that's what that is. But yeah. Graeme, I'm going to drag you kicking and screaming into modern day, okay? So things are about to go all colourful for you. I want to take your view on where we are now. It was a busy 2023. I think 2024 has started off very much the same. In a way, I think some folks are almost getting a bit greedy on what they expect as a quiet or busy UFO news period. Where are we then? So we've had talks of whistleblowers coming forward. We've had David Grush hit the news cycle and come back out. Talk to me. What are your thoughts as a historian on the UFO subject and where it's landing now? No pun intended.
Yeah, we've had periods, maybe not as intensive as this, because the way that the kind of 24-hour news cycle and the fact that you can get instant news nowadays is a bit different from more of a historical perspective. But we have had periods of time before where there's been a kind of a bit of a impetus in terms of pushing things forward. At the end of the 1960s, with the congressional hearings, such as there was a symposium on UFOs, the Condon Committee, the University of Colorado project from Edward Condon. So people, obviously, we know how that ended up. But before those things concluded, there was a bit of a kind of, we're in exciting times here. Hopefully, we're going to get some sort of movement from the government. Hopefully, there's going to be a scientific push towards understanding what's happened. Now, we're sort of in that position again, albeit we've moved on a little bit. So we have not just the impetus, but we actually have a bit of momentum as well now, because the politicians, for whatever reason, and I'm not entirely sure that all of their intentions are, we want to get to the bottoms of UFOs. I think some of it might also be a little bit, of a case of we're wanting to appeal to voters. Or certain sides of the vote as well, just to show that we're doing something which is quite populist. I'm still sort of a bit kind of unsure about how pure people's intentions are, if you like. But that's just me being old and cynical, I guess. So yes, we've moved on a bit from the initial bits, and we've had a repeats, obviously, of the hearings. So that's great. So hopefully we're going to get some more of those. But the thing that we're still missing are the other whistleblowers. We've had Lou Elizondo. I know he's not a whistleblower in so much he's stood in front of Congress, but he's effectively your patient zero. He's the first person that sort of came out, from 2017 and started talking about this. And then, of course, we've got David Grush, who stood and said the things that you mentioned before, and also Ryan Graves and David Fravor, stood in or sat in front of a congressional committee to talk about about UFOs. I'd like to see that more often. I'd like to see other people there as well, but maybe not necessarily the names that we know. There have to be people from out, the ones that we don't know of, because it would be nice to see much unknown people coming out of the woodwork and saying what they have to say, rather than the same names that we've heard just coming up with the same stuff for decades now. And there's all sorts of names being thrown about when you look at Twitter as to say, this person should sit there, that person should be there. Anybody from Bob Lazar to Stephen Greer is mentioned. And I guess at some stage I thought, well, yeah, maybe it might be nice if Bob Lazar, might testify. But I think if him or Stephen Greer did, it might just set things back, because it would just probably end up as a circus.
Circus was the word I was thinking there, potentially turning into, rightly or wrongly. I know there'd be a lot of interest in that regardless. And I wonder what's something you're maybe looking forward to coming out this year, be it, is it whistleblowers? Is it media? Is it a documentary? Is it a book or something? Or, what is it you're kind of looking forward to seeing or hearing this year?
Lou's book would be the thing that I would most want to read, I think. Obviously, I don't know what else might be coming out, so I can't say. And in terms of other things, I think it'll be something that I just don't expect. That's what I would like to see, because I think that they'll have the more impact. You're always going to expect maybe new videos, whether it's Jeremy Corbell or whether somebody else bringing something out. Documentaries, they're great, but I think their value is actually for trying to inform the general public. James Fox's documentaries are brilliant for that, for getting people, who have maybe either a superficial or no knowledge of ufology to get into the subject and like kind of a starter. I think the phenomenon was a brilliant thing for that. My wife loved it. She watched it with me and she got a lot out of it. So I think that's the value of those. And other documentaries, some of the ones that you see on Netflix and Paramount and whatever, some of them are just awful. So I don't really look forward to documentaries as much as I might once have. And in terms of other people's books, it just depends on what's coming down the turnpike. I'm not aware of anything beyond Lou's, which I'm really excited about hearing, but that doesn't mean to say that if something's announced next month, I won't be. And media, the stuff that appears in terms of videos and pictures, I know your view on this is, well, it's a picture. It doesn't get me very far. I think that's right, isn't it?
I mean, I like to see them, and same with the videos. But I don't hang my hat on them.
Me too. Yeah, so that's and I think we've discussed this at length as well in private, that it doesn't really get you any far, because things can be fake nowadays as well. There's so many different ways to fake video, never mind static imagery, that I don't have enough of a filter to be able to discriminate fact from fiction when I'm seeing a photograph anymore. And now when you've got deep fake technology, that anything I guess that's video can probably go the same way. So it'd have to be something with provenance. And I guess that's maybe why those 3 FLIR videos from the US Navy are still the kind of gold standard, if you like, for nowadays. And especially the gimbal footage, because it does have a chain of evidence, if you like, and it has you can see where it came from, and it's almost impeachable, kind of impeccable sources. So yeah.
I think many years ago, Graeme, Adele came out with her seminal work, Chasing Pavements, and you've broken the mould by releasing Chasing Shadows now. So you are the Adele of the UFO topic in my eyes. And if you've not picked up Graeme's work, it's an essential look at the history of the UFO topic, not just Chasing Shadows, but going back through his other work. I'm not going to list them all. He's done the interviews. If you enjoyed this one, go back and listen to them. They are very much encyclopedias that you need to jump into to look at the history of a UFO topic. That I think goes some way like Graeme says, to explaining and exploring what's happening now and what mistakes have been made in the past, or what's went well in the past and we can kind of learn from. If you've got the book already, fantastic. Go onto Amazon, please, and leave Graeme a review. That means a lot to him, I know, and also it really helps in kind of getting the I don't know. Does it help with the algorithm on there? I don't know. But do you know what? I think when you jump on Amazon and see 55 5-star reviews, then yeah,
that's the way it works. Yeah, if you see good reviews or just reviews in general, you're more likely to think, oh, it might be worth picking up a copy. So yeah, that does help.
And Graeme, what are you working on now, and any appearances this year you want to let folks know about?
So I am working on a sequel to the Foo Fighters book because I've found a whole lot more information in the National Archives, which has never seen the light of day before by the looks of it. It's certainly never been published anywhere, so I think that should get a wider audience. And I have been invited to a conference at Hull in September, the Outer Limits conference. So I will be popping down there to do a lecture and hopefully sell some books down there.
Wonderful. I might pop down to that one with you as well. So we never know. Might pop along. Not that that's reason for anyone to go. If anything, it might be reason not to go, so I might not announce it. But Graeme, as always, mate, thank you very much for joining us. Folks, go and pick up a copy of Graeme's work, jump back into the archive and listen to his interviews. And Graeme's appeared on Coast to Coast and most other UFO podcasts and shows available as well. So always worth checking out. Do you know what? You're one of those guys, Graeme. You've put in the hard yards on this topic and subject in just a few years, and it's paid dividends for you. And you deserve all the yachts you can get. So well done.
Thanks.
That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet, and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/That UFO Podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO Podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little Baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little grass.